Welcome to the Midnight Storytellers Legacy Project. I'm Chloe, and if you make yourself comfortable, I have a story to tell you. In East Africa, in a village, there was once a woodcarver. Now, he'd lived there a very long time, but he was on his own, and the villagers didn't know how old he was. They didn't know if he was happy or unhappy. They really didn't know a lot about him at all, except that as the years went by, he was getting more and more eccentric. He took to listening to customers, asking for him to make work for them. He used to make wonderful door guardians, those tall, carved, single pieces of wood that he used to hollow out and shape into standing figures and leaping fish, but he wasn't doing those anymore. He used to make bowls and plates that were so smooth they were like satin to the touch, but he wasn't doing those anymore. Instead, he would listen to what a customer was asking for, and then his gaze would go into the distance and he'd say, "No, that's not what I'm looking for." And the customer would leave. And then the villagers were starting to get quite worried because their woodcarver took to wandering off into the bush, and he'd be all by himself all day, and all he had with him was his wood-carving knife, the only tool he ever used, a knife so old the blade was half worn away, and the other thing he had was his digging stick, and that's all he took with him. And there were lions out there were elephants out there were African hunting dogs that would wear you down in pursuit. And if you went down to the river, there could be a hippopotamus that would squish you. And if none of those things happened, there might be something that bit you or stung you. But nothing like that ever happened to the woodcarver. One morning, the villagers found their woodcarver hard at work again. He was sitting on his three-legged stool outside his hut, and in front of him he had a person-sized log of ebony. Most of you will know that ebony is the toughest wood in the world, and somehow he was working it, he was shaping it, he was smoothing it, and all he had was that half worn out knife. He worked on it for days. He worked on it for weeks. And eventually, he'd shaped that log of ebony into a curvaceous, beautiful woman. He stood her up on her feet and balanced her. From the pocket of his shabby shorts, he took out a glistening fine gold chain. He fastened the chain around the tree woman's neck, and a moment later she opened her eyes and smiled at him. And he smiled right back. There was a wedding, there was a feast, there was a huge party. Everyone was so happy for their woodcarver and the love that he had not just found, but made for himself. And now he was working all the hours. He was working to make as much money as he possibly could to keep his new wife in the style to which he wanted her to become accustomed, because he was buying her presents. He was buying her bright silks. He was buying her gifts of gold, earrings and great big necklace chains and bangles and rings and gold chains for her waist and ankle bracelets and toe rings. He brought her everything. She glistened, she gleamed, she cheeked with gold. And everyone was really happy for them both. Of course, now his reputation spread again. And customers were coming back. Customers were coming from miles around to see his wonderful work and pay good money for it and see the woodcarver, this extraordinary man in his shabby old shorts tied up with string, wandering about in flip-flops. One day there came a servant from a warlord, Now this warlord had his compound somewhere up near Nairobi, but the servant had come all that way to ask the woodcarver to make a big set of bowls and plates. And while they were negotiating the deal, the servant was looking at the woodcarver's wife. In fact, he couldn't take his eyes off her. And when the servant went back up to the warlord's compound, well, he was talking to everyone about this exquisite woman that he'd seen. 3 days later, jeeps came roaring out of the night. There were floodlights, there was machine gun fire. The villagers knew well enough to grab their babies and a few belongings and crawl secretly out of the back of the huts and run away into the bush to hide. But when they came back in the quiet and the mists of the next morning, the only damage they found was the woodcarver's hut, completely trashed, and the man himself lying badly beaten. His wife was gone. The warlord had taken her. He took her back to his compound, he put her in a room and he locked the door, and he went in from time to time, first of all trying to talk sweetly to her, trying to win her, trying to woo her. He got no response. Then, of course, he became angry and got no response. And then the warlord gave the tree woman to his men. But whatever was done, whatever was said or shouted, she looked straight through them all. She gave no response at all. And then one morning, the warlord let himself into her room, and his heart leapt inside him because she was smiling. She was standing at the window, and as she turned to him, she was smiling. But as soon as she saw it was him, the smile was wiped out. She'd been smiling at something, someone outside the building. And the warlord realized she'd been listening to a song, a chant coming in through the window. There was her husband standing outside the compound gate. He wasn't trying to come in. He wasn't challenging the guards. He was just standing there and calling in to where his wife was standing at the window. He said, "The woman is yours, the gold is mine, give it back. The woman is yours, the gold is mine, give it back." And as he chanted those words over and over again, the tree woman was taking off her gold trinkets, taking off the bracelets and the waist chains and the bangles and the rings and all the shining, glittering treasure. She crunched up in her hands and threw it out of the window to land in the dust at her husband's feet. And finally, she came to that thin, glinting gold chain that she unfastened and crunched up in her hand and hurled that last gold chain flying out of the window back to her husband. And as she threw it, her dark arm and fingers lengthened and twisted and gnarled, and next moment there was an ebony tree with its branches smashing up through the roof, tiles flying in all directions, its roots plunging and crashing down through the floors right through into the basement. And the moment after that, the entire building imploded. Hours after the dust settled, there was movement in the rubble. A dark, pudgy hand pushed up, pushed bricks aside, scrabbled to freedom. The warlord hauled himself out in the tattered remnants of his uniform. He looked around him at the ruins of everything, and he started to walk. He walked for 3 days and 3 nights, and in the quiet and mists of one morning, the warlord arrived at the village. People saw him and ran to hide indoors, but he paid no attention to them. He walked right through the middle of the village until he came to the woodcarver's hut. The woodcarver was sitting and working on something, sitting on his three-legged stool, and he looked up as the warlord came to him. The warlord stopped in front of him and looked down and said, "I want to learn. Please." The woodcarver looked into his eyes. In his hand he had his old knife, that half-worn-out blade. And then he turned the knife around and held it out, handle first. And the warlord took it and nodded at the woodcarver and turned and walked away into the bush alone.